The Coalition Military Academy had stood for nearly 6 centuries. Built into the heart of an artificial moon orbiting Asterion Prime, it trained the officers who would one day command fleets, defend entire sectors, and decide the fate of civilizations. Its architecture belonged to no single species. Towering vaulted ceilings accommodated even the 3-meter-tall Corathans, while gravity-adjustable platforms and modular seating allowed dozens of vastly different races to study side by side. Every corridor displayed the banners of Coalition member worlds. Every wall bore the names of battles that had shaped galactic history. Everything about the Academy existed for one purpose: to prepare soldiers for war. This morning, however, the training grounds stood unusually quiet. Instead of drills and live-fire exercises, thousands of recruits streamed toward the Hall of Strategic Studies, the Academy's largest lecture theater. The immense chamber rose like a stadium, nearly 3,000 cadets seated in concentric tiers beneath a domed ceiling, alive with dormant holographic projectors. Every seat was occupied. Young recruits from more than 40 species filled the hall with the familiar murmur of students everywhere. Some debated fleet doctrine. Others compared scores from yesterday's endurance trials. A few argued over whether autonomous drones would one day replace infantry altogether. Despite their many differences, they all shared one expectation. Today's lecture was going to be painfully boring. Theoretical studies, one cadet groaned. I'd rather run 10 kilometers in triple gravity. You say that every week, and every week I'm right. Soft laughter spread through their row. At precisely 0900 hours, the conversation ceased. The massive doors at the rear of the hall slid open without a sound. Instructor Orinth entered. Unlike many Academy lecturers who enjoyed displaying their decorations, Orinth wore a simple dark gray instructor's uniform devoid of ornamentation, save for a single Coalition crest upon the collar. His age was difficult to estimate. His silver-scaled skin suggested decades of service, while the faint scars crossing one side of his face hinted at a military career far removed from classrooms. He walked without hurry. 3,000 cadets instinctively straightened in their seats. Orinth reached the center of the circular platform. He looked around the enormous hall, patiently allowing the silence to settle completely before speaking. "Good morning, cadets." "Good morning, instructor." Their response thundered through the chamber with practiced precision. Orinth inclined his head. "Today," he began evenly, "you will not be learning battlefield tactics." Several students exchanged puzzled looks. "We will not discuss superior weapons. We will not examine military technology. We will not analyze command structures." The silence deepened. "We will not even discuss teamwork." That finally caught everyone's attention. A military academy lecture that wasn't about tactics, weapons, technology, or coordination. What exactly was left? Orinth folded his hands behind his back. "Instead, today's lesson concerns courage. It concerns duty." He paused. "It concerns making the impossible choice when logic screams at you to step aside." He allowed those words to linger. "And in my opinion, there exists no better example of this than humanity." The reaction was immediate. The moment the words left Instructor Orinth's mouth, a low murmur broke the silence. Near the middle rows, a young Vectari recruit leaned toward the cadet seated beside him, making no real effort to lower his voice. "Well, that explains it." His friend tilted his head. "If today's lesson isn't about superior weapons or advanced technology, then of course it's about humans." A few nearby recruits burst into quiet laughter. Several rows around them joined in, amused by the remark. Instructor Orinth heard every word. His eyes drifted toward the laughing recruits for only a moment. Then, instead of correcting them, the old instructor simply smiled. It wasn't the smile of someone offended. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly how the next hour was going to unfold. He didn't acknowledge the comment. Instead, he activated the holographic display. A single line of text appeared behind him. Historical Case Study 117A. Orinth turned back toward the hall. "Today's lesson concerns a retired human soldier." The murmurs faded. "He fought approximately 40 armed robbers, alone." The silence dissolved into a wave of subdued murmurs that rolled through the tiers of seats. Cadets exchanged skeptical glances. Others quietly whispered to those beside them. A few couldn't hide faint smiles. Near the middle rows, Kirex, the young Vectari recruit who had mocked humanity only moments earlier, leaned back slightly in his seat. A faint grin tugged at the corners of his mandibles as he slowly raised one hand. "Permission to speak, instructor." Instructor Orinth nodded. The young recruit stood respectfully. "With all due respect, instructor, we understand the purpose of these historical lectures." A few nearby cadets nodded. They're meant to teach principles, leadership, discipline, morality. He shrugged, and sometimes the stories are embellished. Faint laughter rippled once more through the room. The recruit spread his hands apologetically. But a single retired human defeating 40 criminals. He smiled politely. At least, keep it realistic, sir. A reptilian cadet chimed in from across the aisle. I've read human history. They do enjoy making legends out of impossible odds. Kyrex added with a grin. Next you'll tell us he did it with a knife. This time, even more recruits laughed. Only Instructor Orinth remained composed, neither frowning nor offering a single word in humanity's defense. Instead, a faint, almost imperceptible smile crossed his face. Every academy year began the same way. A new class, the same skeptical expressions, the same whispered jokes, and the same absolute certainty that the story was impossible. And every year, it ended in exactly the same silence. He had long since stopped counting how many times he had watched confidence dissolve into stunned disbelief before the class was over. So, he simply waited. As he knew they would, the murmurs gradually subsided until the lecture hall fell perfectly still. Orinth looked at Kyrex. You believe the story is exaggerated? Yes, instructor. And many of you agree. Nods spread throughout the lecture hall. I expected as much. A faint smile touched the instructor's face. In fact, your skepticism is exactly why today's lesson exists. He pressed a control on the console. The lights dimmed. The holographic display flickered to life. Fortunately, I don't have to rely on stories. The title vanished. In its place appeared grainy security footage from the interior of an aging civilian passenger vessel. A timestamp materialized in one corner, along with a date. Archivin security recording. Age, 67 standard years. Instructor Orinth looked back at the sea of suddenly attentive faces. This, he said quietly, is the actual footage. The lecture hall became so silent that 3,000 future officers could hear the faint electrical hum of the ancient recording as history prepared to speak for itself. The holographic display flickered to life. The image showed the interior of a civilian passenger vessel. Several cadets immediately recognized the design. It belonged to an earlier generation, built long before strict coalition security standards became commonplace. In those days, civilian travel relied more on trust than protection. Comprehensive baggage screening and armed security were considered unnecessary luxuries. It was a more peaceful era, or at least people believed it was. The vessel reflected that philosophy. Instead of the wide passenger decks common aboard modern cruisers, it consisted of narrow coaches linked by pressurized corridors barely wide enough for two adults to pass abreast. A design built for efficiency. One that, as later investigations would conclude, became a deadly trap once criminals seized control of a single coach. Coach 7. A side hatch slid open. Passengers boarded in an orderly stream. Merchants, families, students, workers. Ordinary civilians with no reason to believe this journey would become a lesson taught at the Coalition Military Academy. Then the cameras found him, a human. He stepped aboard carrying nothing more than a worn travel bag slung over one shoulder. He wasn't especially tall. If anything, he stood noticeably shorter than many of the species around him. His dark civilian jacket had seen years of use, and faint streaks of gray had already begun appearing around his temples. Nothing about him drew attention. Nothing suggested he had once spent decades as a soldier. He found an empty seat beside the viewport. As he placed his travel bag beneath the seat, the camera briefly caught the curved blade hanging from his belt. The archival system automatically highlighted it. Authorized ceremonial sidearm. Human cultural exemption. Had someone paused the recording at that exact moment and asked the cadets to identify the future hero of the incident, few would have pointed toward the quiet human gazing absent-mindedly through the window. Across a few aisles sat a family of 3 belonging to the Lithari, a species the cadets recognized immediately. Their smooth ivory skin and delicate cranial crests made them unmistakable. The parents spoke softly while their daughter excitedly scrolled through a medical textbook projected above a handheld learning tablet. She couldn't have been much older than 20. Occasionally she would point at an anatomical diagram floating above the device while enthusiastically explaining something to her parents. Her eyes carried the restless zest of someone eager to begin the life she'd spent years preparing for. Even through the recording, fragments of their conversation drifted across the compartment. You still skipped breakfast. Because I overslept. You're going to be treating patients soon. Doctors who forget to eat make terrible decisions. The young woman rolled her eyes with practiced affection. "Mother, I'm studying medicine, not performing heart transplants tomorrow." Her father chuckled. "Give her a few years, then she'll be correcting our prescriptions." Several cadets found themselves smiling with her. The recording continued. Stations came and went, passengers boarded, others departed. Children wandered briefly into the aisles before worried parents guided them back to their seats. A service attendant moved through the coach, quietly delivering pre-ordered meals and hot beverages to waiting passengers. The human remained where he was, sometimes reading, sometimes simply watching the stars slip silently past the window. Nothing about the journey seemed unusual, until it did. The vessel had only recently departed another transit station when a passenger near the rear of Coach 7 suddenly stood. At first, nobody paid him much attention. People stood all the time to stretch their legs, to retrieve luggage, to visit another coach. Then he drew a large knife. Conversations faltered. The nearest passengers stiffened, unsure whether they had just witnessed a misunderstanding or the beginning of something far worse. Before anyone could react, another traveler several rows ahead rose to his feet. A long combat machete slid from beneath his coat. Then a third man stood, a fourth. Almost simultaneously, armed figures began rising throughout the coach, as though responding to a silent signal only they could hear. As they stood, dark face coverings were pulled from beneath their collars and drawn over their noses and mouths in one practiced motion. Within seconds, 12 masked robbers controlled every aisle of Coach 7. Their weapons varied widely. Heavy combat machetes, whose edges had seen years of abuse, shock batons crackling with unstable blue arcs, illegal plasma cutters repurposed into close-range weapons. At their center stood a broader, older male whose commanding presence marked him as the leader. Unlike the others, he carried no loot bag. His face was hidden behind the same dark mask worn by the rest of the gang, but the way the others instinctively deferred to him left no doubt who was in charge. A heavy plasma cleaver rested comfortably in his grip, its edge humming with a dangerous blue glow. Even through the decades-old recording, the cadets could see surprise ripple through the compartment. Incidents like this were precisely why civilian transportation would later undergo sweeping security reforms. In those days, determined criminals could still exploit weaknesses that would be unthinkable by modern standards. None of the weapons were military issue, none of them looked expensive, but every one of them looked capable of killing. Panic spread through the coach almost instantly. Someone screamed, a child burst into tears, several passengers shrank back into their seats, clutching loved ones or frozen in stunned disbelief. One middle-aged alien reacted before anyone else. He lunged toward the nearest emergency panel. He never reached it. One of the robbers stepped forward and brought the butt of his combat machete crashing across the side of the man's head. The impact threw him into the seats with a sickening crack. He collapsed to the floor, clutching his bleeding face as stunned silence swept through the compartment. The robber rested the machete on his shoulder and looked around the silent compartment with a crooked grin. "Now that I have everyone's attention," his eyes swept across the terrified passengers. "This is a robbery." He spread his free hand almost casually. "Nobody needs to be a hero. Hand over your credits, valuables, and personal devices, and everyone gets to go home safe and sound." He glanced down at the groaning passenger lying at his feet. Well, almost everyone. Passengers obeyed almost immediately. Wallets, necklaces, communication tablets, credits, everything was placed into waiting sacks without resistance. The camera eventually reached him. The human looked up as one of the robbers stopped beside him. Without protest, he reached into his jacket, removed his wallet, placed it into the sack. His wristwatch followed, then a small credit chip. The robber glanced down, apparently satisfied, before moving toward the next passenger. In the lecture hall, a low murmur swept through the cadets once again. Kirex tilted his head slightly. "So far," he muttered, just loudly enough for those around him to hear. "I count 12. He glanced sideways toward his classmates. "I thought the story was 40. A female cadet seated beside him, Lissa of the Ashari, kept her eyes fixed on the recording. Without looking at him, she whispered, "This is not over yet." Kirex folded his arms but said nothing. Elsewhere in the hall, another recruit frowned. "I don't understand. He was a soldier." Several nearby cadets nodded in agreement. If he intended to fight, why surrender his valuables? That doesn't seem very brave. No one answered. At the front of the lecture hall, Instructor Orinth remained silent. His attention never left the recording. He knew the answer. The cadets simply hadn't reached it yet. The robbery unfolded with practiced efficiency. Pairs of robbers spread through the coach, stripping passengers of anything valuable with frightening speed. Credit chips, jewelry, personal communicators, bags were emptied into large canvas sacks without ceremony. Anyone who hesitated received the flat of a blade across the shoulder or a shove back into their seat. Across the aisle, the Lithari family surrendered everything they owned. The father placed his credit wallet into the robber's outstretched hand. The mother quietly removed the necklace from around her neck, her fingers trembling so violently she nearly dropped it. Their daughter set down her learning tablet and surrendered it without protest. For a moment, it seemed they would be treated no differently than anyone else. Then one of the robbers stopped walking. His eyes lingered on the young woman far longer than they had any reason to. He turned his head ever so slightly toward his companions. One answered with a slow, malicious nod. Without a word, a decision had already been made. The robber reached forward and clamped a rough hand around the young woman's wrist. Confusion flashed across her face. Then she saw the look in his eyes. Her blood ran cold. "What are you doing?" the robber answered by jerking her violently into the aisle. She cried out as she stumbled against the seats. Her father reacted before thought could catch him. "No!" He lunged toward his daughter. The crackling blue arc of a shock baton met him halfway. The weapon struck squarely across his chest. His entire body convulsed. For a split second, every muscle locked rigid before he collapsed heavily across the aisle, unconscious before he hit the floor. "Dad!" The young woman tried to break free. Another robber caught her by the shoulder. A third laughed. "Take her!" Her mother threw herself forward, desperately clawing at the arm dragging her daughter away. She was shoved back so violently that she crashed into the seats behind her. "No! Please, please don't!" The robbers ignored her. They began dragging the terrified young woman toward the empty space between two luggage sections farther down the coach. She struggled desperately now. Her voice echoed through the compartment. "Help me!" She looked from face to face, at the dozens of terrified passengers who refused to meet her eyes. "Please, someone, please help me." Nobody moved. Some lowered their heads. Others clutched their own children tighter. A few simply closed their eyes. Fear had done exactly what the robbers wanted. It had stolen everyone's courage. Across the lecture hall, every cadet remained transfixed. The quiet murmurs that had greeted the recording were gone. Hundreds of eyes remained fixed on the projection, watching the frozen passengers with growing unease. Orinth knew what would happen next. He always did. Yet even after all these years, the next few moments never lost their power. The terrified young woman struggled with everything she had, her heels scraping helplessly against the deck as the robbers dragged her toward the rear of the coach. Row after row passed beneath her scraping heels. Then they reached the quiet human. One of the robbers was laughing, the other tightened his grip on her wrist. Then, something moved. A flash of cold steel cut through the air so quickly that few in the compartment even registered it. The robber took another step, then another. He frowned. The hand gripping her wrist no longer answered him. For the briefest heartbeat, he simply stared in confusion. Dark violet blood began to drip onto the deck, then it poured. His severed hand, still clamped around the young woman's wrist, tumbled to the floor with a dull thud. The girl stumbled free, collapsing backward in shock as the lifeless hand finally released its grip. A heartbeat later, the scream came, raw, animal. The robber dropped to his knees, clutching the ruined stump where his wrist had been only moments before. Every sound inside Coach 7 died. The laughter, the crying, even the mother's desperate sobs. Everything stopped. Passengers stared in frozen disbelief at the blood spreading across the aisle. The remaining robbers instinctively took a step back. Not one of them had seen the strike, but they saw him. Standing between the fallen girl and the robbers was the quiet human who had surrendered his belongings without a word. His posture was calm, his breathing steady. In his right hand rested a worn kukuri. Across humanity, it was more than a knife. It was a symbol carried by warriors whose reputation had long outlived the empires they once served. The ancient weapon seemed almost out of place among plasma tools and crackling shock batons, yet somehow it looked exactly where it belonged. Fresh blood traced the inward curve of its broad blade before dripping silently onto the floor. The young woman looked up at the stranger shielding her. The robbers looked at the same man and froze. Shock eclipsed every trace of arrogance on their faces. None of them had seen him move. None of them understood what had just happened. For several long seconds, no one moved. The wounded robber sat on the deck, frantically trying to align his severed hand with the bleeding stump of his wrist. His cries echoed through Coach 7. Every pair of eyes remained fixed upon the old man standing between the robbers and the terrified young woman. The leader's gaze drifted from the kukuri to the wounded robber, then back to the human. His expression hardened. "You just signed your own death warrant, human." He pointed at the human. "Kill him." Robbers surged forward at once. Few rushed the aisle with combat machetes raised high. Close behind them came others carrying crackling shock batons, while one veered toward the rows of passenger seats, searching for a path that might let him flank the human. They had the numbers. The aisle did not. It was barely wide enough for two grown men to stand shoulder to shoulder. The lead pair found themselves compressed into the narrow corridor, their own bodies stealing room from one another, while the men behind crowded impatiently, looking for an opening that simply wasn't there. The human had chosen his ground without taking a single deliberate step. Behind him were the rescued girl and dozens of helpless passengers. In front of him, the narrow aisle reduced 11 robbers to little more than a queue. To the passengers, it still looked hopeless. The human did not move, not until the first robber committed. The machete swept downward in a powerful arc. The human shifted half a step to his left. Steel met empty air. The attack carried the robber forward, just enough for the human to drive his shoulder into the larger man's chest. Already off balance from the missed strike, the robber crashed backward into his companion, clogging the narrow aisle with two struggling bodies. Only then did the kukuri move. It rose in a short, economical arc. One robber cried out, his weapon clattering across the deck as he crumpled against the seats. The second barely had time to recover before the human pivoted, using the falling man as both shield and obstacle. The crackling head of the shock baton struck the collapsing robber instead, blue arcs dancing harmlessly across his clothing. Confusion erupted. "What are you doing?" "I didn't." The protest was cut short as the human stepped through the opening before the bottleneck could clear. The kukuri flashed again. Another weapon spun from suddenly limp fingers. The fourth robber abandoned any hope of circling behind. Instead, he vaulted across the armrests of two passenger seats, trying to force an angle on the human's exposed side before the aisle opened again. He was too late. Without turning his head, the human drove an elbow backward into the attacker's jaw. The impact staggered him just long enough for the old soldier to seize his wrist and hurl him back across the seats he had just crossed. Every passenger could do nothing but stare, bewildered by the scene unfolding before them. The exchange had lasted only moments, yet the aisle looked entirely different. Weapons lay scattered across the floor. Several robbers struggled to rise. Others remained where they had fallen, stunned less by their injuries than by how completely the narrow passage had turned their superior numbers against them. Only then did a thin line of crimson appear along the human's left sleeve. One of the machetes had found him after all. The cut was shallow. He didn't even glance at it. His attention never left the men standing before him. For the first time since the robbery had begun, the remaining robbers hesitated. They had expected panic. They had expected desperate resistance. They had not expected a man who understood the battlefield better than they did, and certainly not from the quiet, middle-aged passenger carrying an old ceremonial knife. The hesitation lasted only a heartbeat. Then it shattered. With a roar of unrestrained fury, the leader charged, shoving his own men aside and trampling over the wounded without the slightest hesitation. The humming edge of his plasma cleaver carved through the air as the remaining robbers surged in behind him. They no longer cared about finesse or coordination. Rage had replaced discipline. Once again, the aisle betrayed them. The narrow passage that had moments earlier become the human's shield now became their prison. The men at the rear could do nothing but press against those ahead, their own numbers stealing the room needed to fight. The leader forced his way to the front. Unlike the others, he did not swing wildly. He watched, measured, waited, then struck. The plasma cleaver hissed through the air in a fast horizontal sweep aimed at the human's ribs. The human leaned back just enough for the glowing blade to pass inches from his jacket before stepping inside the robber's reach. The kukuri answered in a blur. The leader barely twisted aside in time. Steel scraped against the reinforced guard wrapped around his forearm, sending sparks across the aisle. For the first time, someone had survived the kukuri. A flicker of surprise crossed the human's face. It vanished just as quickly. The leader pressed the advantage, driving forward with another heavy swing, forcing the human backward a single step. The robbers behind him cheered. It lasted less than a second. The human suddenly shifted off the center line. The plasma cleaver bit harmlessly into the edge of a passenger seat. Before the leader could wrench it free, the human stepped in. The butt of the kukuri struck him squarely across the face. The crack echoed through the compartment. His vision exploded into white. The impact ripped the mask from his face and split the skin above his right brow. Blood immediately flooded into one eye as he staggered backward several paces. His nose crunched audibly beneath the blow, and the plasma cleaver slipped from his grasp, clattering onto the deck. The men behind him instinctively reached to catch their commander. They only succeeded in trapping themselves together. The human moved, no flourish, no wasted motion. The kukuri flashed through the bottleneck once, then again. A machete spun across the floor. A shock baton skidded beneath the seats. Another robber collapsed into his companions, turning the narrow aisle into a tangled wall of bodies. Within moments, the remaining attackers had been driven back, bruised, bleeding, or struggling simply to remain standing. Silence returned. The leader wiped blood from his mouth with the back of his hand. His chest rose and fell in ragged breaths. He stared at the lone human as though seeing him for the first time. Then his face twisted with hatred. "You," he snarled, "you will not leave this train alive. Do you hear me?" His hand shot to the communicator clipped to his belt. "All units." His voice thundered through the coach. "Coach 7, now!" He glared at the human with bloodshot eyes. "There are 40 of us." The compartment held its breath. A faint smile touched the corners of the human's lips. His eyes drifted briefly toward the robbers scattered across the aisle, some unconscious, others writhing in pain, their discarded weapons strewn across the deck. Then he looked back at the leader. Their eyes met. There were. The leader's face contorted with fury. A thin stream of dark violet blood trickled from the gash above his brow, running down the side of his face as his grip tightened around the communicator. Then the doors at both ends of Coach 7 burst open. Heavy boots thundered against the deck. Masked robbers poured in from Coach 6. More flooded through from Coach 8. Passengers screamed as blades, shock batons, and plasma cutters appeared from both directions, sealing every escape. The bottleneck that had protected the human moments earlier had become a trap. For the first time since drawing his kukuri, he stood surrounded. The orderly robbery had now dissolved into chaos. Men shouted contradictory orders. Passengers screamed. Weapons flashed above the crowded seats. The human understood one thing clearly. The moment the attacks began from both directions, the fight changed completely. If he remained in the center of the aisle, even for a few seconds, the robbers would overwhelm him through sheer numbers. There was only one chance: never let them strike together. He edged toward whichever side pressed closest, meeting that threat first. A quick slash, a hard shove, a body sent crashing backward into the men behind it. Before the opposite side could seize the opening, he pivoted to meet the next attack. Again and again. The wounded, the fallen, and the robbers desperately trying to force their way forward became obstacles that disrupted their own advance. Every man the human drove backward bought him another precious second before the attackers from the opposite direction could close the distance. The human never paused. A blade came from the front, then another. The aisle became a relentless rhythm of attack and response. Steel rang against steel. Shock batons hissed with angry blue arcs. A plasma cutter carved a glowing scar across the bulkhead where the human's head had been a fraction of a second earlier. Every heartbeat demanded another decision. Turn, block, advance, retreat, never linger, never overcommit. Around them, terrified passengers pressed themselves into every corner they could find. Families huddled behind overturned seats. Others lay flat against the deck, shielding children beneath their bodies as blades flashed overhead and crackling shock batons narrowly missed the rows where they hid. No one dared move. In the chaos, being noticed could be as deadly as joining the fight. The robbers gradually discovered that numbers alone solved nothing. Every time too many crowded the aisle, they blocked one another's weapons as effectively as they blocked the human's escape. Men shoved, cursed, and stumbled over fallen comrades. More than once, wild swings intended for the human struck their own allies instead. Their overwhelming numbers had become a prison of their own making. Still they came, again and again. The cuts on the human's body multiplied. One slash opened the fabric across his shoulder. Another left a crimson line along his ribs. His breathing grew heavier. His movements, however, lost none of their precision. To the terrified passengers, it no longer looked as though the human was fighting 30 men. It looked as though he was holding back a flood. Each time the robbers seemed ready to overwhelm him, the curved kukuri appeared where it needed to be, breaking their momentum for one more heartbeat. The rescued Lothari girl had crawled behind a row of seats with her unconscious father and weeping mother. She stared at the lone figure standing between her family and the advancing robbers. She finally understood. The old soldier had not drawn his blade because he believed he could defeat them all. He had drawn it because someone had to stand. Around her, the compartment had become unrecognizable. Seats lay splintered. Luggage littered the floor. The air carried the sharp scent of scorched metal and ozone from discharged shock batons. Somewhere amid the chaos, the purpose of the robbery had quietly changed. No robber reached for abandoned valuables. No one looked toward the terrified Lithari girl anymore. Every blade, every shout, every desperate charge was directed at one man. The lone human had become the battle. Frustration slowly gave way to desperation. As the battle raged on, the human no longer counted the attacks. He simply answered them. One step, one strike, one breath, then another. Gradually, the relentless assault slowed. The robbers no longer rushed him blindly. They stood just beyond the reach of the blood-stained Kukuri, circling, watching, searching for an opening that never came. Quiet arguments broke out among them as they pointed toward the narrow aisle, the rows of seats, the wounded men still sprawled across the floor. Every plan ended the same way. Someone would have to be the first to step within the old soldier's reach. No one volunteered. The human remained where he was, chest rising with heavy breaths, the Kukuri held low but unwavering. The human refused to give up. Then, a piercing alarm erupted throughout the ship. Its shrill tone cut through the chaos with such sudden force that even the fighting faltered. For a fraction of a second, every eye instinctively lifted toward the ceiling. A calm, synthetic voice echoed through every compartment. Emergency protocol activated. A distress signal has been transmitted to the nearest coalition security station. Emergency docking sequence initiated. Estimated arrival, 10 minutes. Silence lasted only a heartbeat. Then the realization struck. 10 minutes. The words hit the robbers far harder than any blade. The leader's gaze swept across the compartment. He finally saw the battlefield for what it had become. Half his crew lay wounded or unconscious. The rest were exhausted, shaken, and struggling to break the lone human standing before them. Beyond him, the passengers no longer cowered in fear, and the valuables they had demanded lay abandoned across the floor. They had gained nothing. And now coalition authorities were coming. In that moment, the leader understood the truth. The robbery had already failed. Dark violet blood still trickled from the cut above his brow as panic replaced rage. "Disperse," he roared. "Drop the weapons. Take off the masks. Blend in with the passengers. Move." The order spread through the robbers faster than any command he'd given that day. The men who had stormed into Coach 7, roaring with confidence, now pushed past one another in desperate silence, disappearing into adjoining coaches in the hope of becoming just another frightened traveler before security arrived. Machetes clattered onto the deck. Shock batons were shoved beneath seats. Masks vanished into jackets. Within moments, the fighting was over. Only the alarm remained. Its relentless pulse echoed through the shattered compartment. The human did not chase them. He stood exactly where he had stood from the beginning. His breathing came in slow, heavy breaths. Blood dripped steadily from the cuts along his arms, staining the deck beneath his boots. The Kukuri hung low in his hand, its curved blade streaked with violet. Behind him, dozens of terrified passengers stared at the human in stunned silence. For several long seconds, the human did not move. His weary eyes followed the last of the fleeing robbers as they disappeared through the adjoining doors, casting away their weapons and masks in desperate attempts to become indistinguishable from the terrified passengers. Only when the final footsteps faded into the distance did he slowly lower the Kukuri. The human drew a long, ragged breath. His shoulders sagged. The tension that had held his battered body together finally slipped away. The blade fell from his hand with a dull metallic clang against the deck. His knees buckled. Before anyone could reach him, the human collapsed heavily onto one knee, catching himself with a trembling hand. The passengers gasped. For the first time, they truly saw the cost of what he had done. His clothes were soaked with blood. Deep cuts covered both forearms where he had intercepted blade after blade. Crimson stains spread across his shoulder and side, while countless smaller wounds marked the price of every second he had held the line. The young Lithari girl broke free from her mother's embrace. She ran straight to the old human. She knelt beside him, her eyes glistening with tears. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the emergency alarm. You saved me." The human looked up at her. Despite the pain etched across his face, a faint, reassuring smile appeared beneath the blood and exhaustion. "Good, you're safe," he said quietly. The words had scarcely left his lips before the last of his strength gave way. His body swayed, then collapsed into unconsciousness. For a heartbeat, the young woman stood frozen. Then her medical training took over. She rushed to the emergency medical cabinet, snatched up dressings and trauma supplies, and dropped to her knees beside him. With trembling hands, she pressed thick gauze against his wounds as fresh blood quickly soaked through the fabric. Around her, the other passengers finally found the courage the old soldier had awakened in them. They gathered without hesitation, supporting his limp body, passing fresh bandages, and activating the ship's medical beacon so emergency medics would be waiting when the vessel reached the station. Minutes earlier, fear had frozen every soul in Coach 7. Now, complete strangers worked together with quiet determination to save the man who had saved them. The recording ended. The projection dissolved into darkness. For several long moments, the lecture hall remained utterly silent. Hundreds of cadets continued staring at the blank display, as though expecting the old human to rise once more. Orinth slowly deactivated the projector and turned to face the hall. His eyes found Kirex almost immediately. The young Vectari avoided his gaze. A faint smile touched the old instructor's face. Cadet Kirex. The recruit slowly looked up. It turns out you were right. Orinth paused for a bit. A ripple of confusion passed through the lecture hall. Then he continued. He really did fight 40 armed robbers with just a knife. The silence carried the weight of the lesson better than any words could. It was Lissa who finally broke it. The young Ashari cadet rose slowly from her seat. Did he survive? Yes. The display came alive one final time with a single photograph, an elderly human in ceremonial uniform. His face bore the same quiet smile, the same calm eyes. Across his chest rested the medals of a lifetime spent serving others. Text slowly appeared beneath the photograph. Name, Bishnu Shrestha. Status, retired soldier. Former unit, 7th Battalion, 8th Gurkha Rifles. Orinth looked at the image for a long moment before speaking. History remembers wars. It remembers empires. It remembers the names of conquerors. He turned back toward the cadets. But every now and then, history remembers one ordinary man. He switched off the projector. The photograph vanished. So the next time you calculate the odds, remember this human, not because he defeated an impossible number of enemies, but because when fear made 300 people freeze, he chose to carry the weight of all of them alone. He gathered his notes. And one more thing. Sometimes the difference between 40 armed men and 40 defeated men is one person who refuses to step aside. Without another word, Orinth gathered his notes and walked from the lecture hall. The cadets slowly began filing from the lecture hall. Gone were the jokes that had filled the room an hour earlier. Some walked in thoughtful silence. Others paused for a final glance at the now dark display before quietly making their way toward the exits. Every year, a new class arrived, convinced the story was impossible. Every year, they left believing otherwise. That was why the Coalition had preserved a decades-old security recording of an ordinary passenger train, and why, for generations to come, every future Coalition officer would watch the story of the human who refused to stand aside.